The idea of surrounding yourself with and immersing yourself into virtual reality still seems like something out of science fiction. And yet, consumer VR hardware is already here, and has been here for so long that a lot of it's gathering dust. The technology that seemed impossible in the 1980s and impractical in the 1990s can now be bought on the high street, and at one point could even be cobbled together out of a smartphone and some cardboard. However, the peak of interest in VR has come and sadly gone in the last decade, moving from the realms of fantasy to the shelves of your local Goodwill. The fact that it ever made it as far as people's homes in the first place is thanks largely to this, the Oculus Rift CV1. The first modern consumer headset turns 10 years old in 2026, and I decided it was time I finally tried one, using a period-appropriate gaming PC. This video was sponsored by Bellroy. When a company that makes backpacks offered to sponsor a video, and I had a VR concept in the works, it seems like a perfect match. Do you think that occurred to me? No, it didn't. I literally just thought of it right now as I was recording this script. Well, the Transit Work Pack from Bellroy is superbly made out of recycled DuraWeave material, with coated YKK zippers inverted to prevent water ingress and keep your laptop, gadgets and other daily essentials nice and dry, even in the British summertime. The Transit is available in either 20 or 26 litre capacities, its harness and back panel are contoured and padded for comfort, and it's available in a range of colours to suit your style. I went with bronze, because apparently that's just what us tech boys do. Bellroy also has a range of accessories from shoulder bags, totes and travel luggage to small items like wallets, watch straps and this tech compact for storing stuff like phone chargers, camera batteries and USB cables. Check them out at bellroy.com and use my code to get 10% off anything in store. I grew up in that era of sci-fi movies that made VR seem cool and dangerous, and I was also a fan of the LucasArts X-Wing series of space flight sims, which I often imagined would be awesome to experience in VR. However, at the time, virtual reality was expensive and impractical, and would remain a largely forgotten niche until well into the 21st century. The Oculus Rift CV1 released in March 2016 after a successful Kickstarter campaign and at a reasonably attractive price point. This would effectively herald the beginning of the modern VR ecosystem. However, at the time, I didn't have a YouTube channel, and my expensive hobby back then was fancy cameras, so I wasn't inclined to spend hundreds of quid on a gaming peripheral for a handful of titles I'd never heard of. These days I'm a self-employed content creation hermit who spends most of his money on stuff to make videos about, and who got a brief taste of the virtual reality experience in an escape room a couple of years ago. The 10th anniversary of the Rift CV1 seemed like an ideal time to jump into my first home VR experience, and to monetize the endeavour. To modern eyes, the CV1 is certainly feeling dated in 2026. The dual LCDs feature 1080 by 1200 panels running at 90Hz, whereas modern headsets can boast fancy OLED and mini LED displays with double the resolution, wider fields of view, pancake lenses and higher refresh rates to boot. But if you haven't experienced any better than this, you might find these specs all fairly meaningless. What won't escape even the most casual of observers is how much stuff there is to set up. Positional trackers, touch controllers, and non-optional cables to hook everything up to a non-optional PC. If you're using a CV1 for VR, it's because you really want to use VR, and are willing to go through quite a lot of inconvenience to do so. As I'm diving into the VR experience, at the same level as someone back in 2016, it seemed appropriate to use a PC from the same era. I built this 2015 anniversary rig last year, and as the CV1 launched a few months before the big 2016 component launches, I decided that it was more appropriate to stick with this rather than upgrading to... Yeesh, 2016 was a pretty dry year for CPUs. The one I've chosen is a 4-core 8-thread i7-6700K, and the GPU is a Maxwell-based GeForce Titan X. At the time the CV1 came out, this would have been cutting-edge stuff, and it'll breeze through the minimum requirements of the first few years of VR games. However, quad-core CPUs are a bit behind the times, and the now unsupported Maxwell graphics cards could have problems with newer titles. But let's see how it does. The oldest game in my test suite is from the same year as the Rift CV1 itself, though calling it a game is a bit generous. Valve's The Lab is a series of minigames and VR experiences to help acclimate new users to virtual environments and train you in the sorts of mechanisms that developers use for these games. It's exceptionally well made, and some of the minigames are quite a lot of fun, as you'd expect coming from Valve. Longbow felt like the most replayable of the bunch, if only because of the steep but fair difficulty curve. The core calibration slingshot was a pleasant, if short-lived, distraction, and I could probably have grown to enjoy the bullet hell game if I gave it more of a chance. It's always nice to see throwbacks to Valve classics like Portal 2, but I was disappointed that I couldn't really play basketball with the planets. Some of the visuals are very pretty, especially in the picture postcards, which start off strong but get pretty weak in some cases. Seriously, Valve, was this the best location you could find in Venice? It's been a very long time since I last played Superhot, but it struck me as the perfect game to test VR with. Although the original Superhot was very much a keyboard and mouse game, it's translated perfectly into a real, authentically VR-ass VR game, making full, intuitive use of the touch controllers and tracking. It took a while to get to grips with the physicality of the game. Stuff that used to be achieved with a mouse click now requires far more physical effort, and I still failed at throwing stuff more than half the time, but this was one of my favourite experiences of the test. It also gave me the somewhat unique experience of being shot in the head over and over again, often in slow motion. Dodging slow-mo bullets is surprisingly hard. People with more VR experience warned me off trying the first-party VR conversions of Bethesda's big hits, and I'm aware that the optimal way to experience Fallout VR is with mods, but I wanted to try the raw, imperfect experience first. There are two navigation methods, and as it turns out, the default one is probably best for me. That means teleporting from spot to spot rather than zooming around with the analog sticks, as while the latter method is the kind you'd expect to use, playing Fallout normally, doing so in VR feels extremely unnatural and can be quite nauseating. Fallout 4 was a fairly dated looking game when it first came out, and has never been what you might call a visual tour de force, but I think VR actually elevates it somewhat. I'd love to play it on a newer headset, as I found the limitations of the CV1 became blindingly obvious almost instantly. A lot of the more dated aspects of Fallout 4's graphics end up hidden behind the low resolution and optical aberrations of the headsets. I cut my experience short after I decided to try out shooting, and got myself murked by a Sputnik. Last month saw the first public open access version of Subnautica 2, but I don't think it officially has VR yet. Plus, it's an Unreal Engine 5 game, and I didn't really think that trying to endure UE5 on a Maxwell GPU was gonna go well, so I stuck with the original. The Rift touch controllers didn't work for me, so I was stuck staring at the menu for a while until I untangled myself from the headset and plugged in a controller, but once I was set up, I found the game ran smoothly and flawlessly. And of course, it looks fantastic. As far as I could tell anyway. I got a few minutes in and started to feel nauseated again. Something about this type of motion just isn't compatible with me, and I don't think I could stand to play this for any length of time. which is a shame because I love Subnautica and would be glad of an excuse to play it again. I feel more at home in Tamriel than Concord, so I was looking forward to trying out 2018's Skyrim VR. I was already getting very comfortable with the teleport method of traversal, which for some reason doesn't trigger my nausea response the same way the constant smooth motion does, so this was a great time for me. I didn't mind combat too much, the longbow works especially well in VR and isn't far behind the one Valve developed for the lab, but sword combat was fine too. Though I imagine I look like a proper knob flailing my arms around like this. It did occur to me, however, that I'm used to playing the remastered version of Skyrim, usually with a ton of mods, and I got to the point where I'd kind of forgotten what the base game looks like. The CV1's optical flaws once again hide quite a lot of imperfections, but I did find myself missing the beauty of the heavily modded Skyrim experience. That being said, seeing these scenes and characters in true binocular 3D does give them a sense of physical presence that you just don't get on a normal display, so even these 2011 era graphics look exceptionally real. Which I guess means scenes like this one must be particularly rough going for arachnophobes. Racing sims are the most obvious use case for VR. Casual gaming is incompatible with large, heavy peripherals that cut you off from the world, but simulation is all about the ritual and the paraphernalia, so a VR headset is as natural a fit as a special seat or a USB gear shift. I, however, am not a sim guy. I play Forza Horizon with an Xbox controller, and fully realistic car handling is a bit too much for me. So, despite having Automobilista 2 in my library for a while, I've never gotten around to trying it until now. I appreciate the details, the authentic car interiors, the working mirrors, and the way the sun plays over the decals on the windscreen. I didn't appreciate the way I started off seated slightly too far back and had a literal out-of-body experience for a second. On the positive side, I didn't feel at all queasy in my time with Automobilista, and that's really saying something considering I don't travel well IRL. I spent the best part of a once-in-a-lifetime helicopter ride over the Grand Canyon, throwing up into a paper bag. My inner teenage X-Wing series fan won't like me for saying this, but you have to take off your rose-tinted glasses before you put on your VR headset. Star Wars Squadrons was not the most seamless VR integration I experienced. My attempts at using the touch controllers were once again stymied by the UI, which really wanted me to use a gamepad instead, and given the reliance on the D-pad for LES controls, I guess I can forgive it this time. I managed to enable and calibrate the headset successfully, but the cutscenes were a headache, literally. Something glitched out and caused the video to be played full screen, split across each eye. So I was left with some inscrutable mess that I had to quickly skip through before it gave me a migraine. Nevertheless, once I got into the game itself, it was glorious. Yes, the limitations of the headset are painfully apparent. The low resolution and so-called screen door effect makes identifying anything pretty tough at a distance, and the limited dynamic range means that highlights blow out easily, but the simple experience of sitting in a beautifully modelled TIE fighter cockpit is so immersive. And in a ship with an open canopy, like the Incom T-65B X-Wing, no, you're a nerd, there's actual tactical application to being able to look around in directions other than the one you're facing. There is no tactical application to turning around and waving at your astromech droid, but I did it anyway. I'd happily play the whole game in VR, even if it means having to close my eyes through the cutscenes. And if I really got into it, then Squadrons could even be enough to convince me to invest in an upgraded headset. Sadly, I get the impression that the game is now dead as far as development updates and online community, and I'd be surprised if there was a sequel, so before I convince myself it's worth investing in something more expensive, I'd like to have more than one game I'm obsessed with. Speaking of, Valve's prequel to Half-Life 2, centred on Alyx Vance, has been touted as the killer app for VR since before its release in 2020, so I was excited to try it out. I was late to Half-Life 1, I think I played it in 2001, but I was obsessed with Half-Life 2 back in the day. In fact, it was one of the games that got me onto the graphics card upgrade train in the first place. Alyx is not overly demanding in the graphics hardware department, with the minimum recommended GPU being the GTX 1060 or Radeon RX 580, cards which are less powerful and have less VRAM than the Titan X. However, the game defaulted to low fidelity, and I didn't get round to trying to increase it. The reason for that is, look at it. I spent ages staring at this opening image, gazing out over the desolation of City 17 and the occupying forces of the Combine. But if I'm honest, it wasn't completely out of a sense of awe and wonder. It's because my headset had fogged up and it felt like I'd suddenly developed cataracts. Once they'd cleared, however, it was stunning to look at. The details are so well made, and the simple act of picking up and playing with stuff encourages you to get to know and use the systems that would all be brand new to someone who hadn't played a VR game before. The world of City 17, as always, feels incredible, and it would be a great place to explore if such a thing were possible, considering, well, the circumstances. The sense of scale is vast. While exploring the rooftops, I very briefly caught myself wondering what this strange metallic object was that had just dropped in front of me, until I realised it was the leg of an enormous walker passing over my head. Even headcrab zombies have what I can only describe as mass. The previous Half-Life games really didn't do these guys justice. Anyway, before I knew it, an hour and a half had passed and I had to forcibly extract myself from the headset to get onto the next game. I have a complicated relationship with the Alien franchise. On the one hand, the first two movies are foundational texts in nerd identity, and I have a soft spot for the third, as it's actually the first one I saw back in 1993 when I was just 10 years old, on a pirated VHS. On the other hand, the franchise fell off pretty hard later on, and the movies have been dead to me since Prometheus. The bright spot of the series for me was in gaming, specifically Alien Isolation, which faithfully recreates a lot of the atmosphere of the 1979 original. I could have modded Isolation to work as a VR game, but I'll be trying out modding in the future, possibly in another video, but I don't want to commit to making more VR content until I see how this does, so I went instead with Rogue Incursion, a formerly VR exclusive title with a lot of very similar aesthetics to Isolation, but a theme that's got more in common with the 1986 movie. In practice, the VR functionality of the game is similar to Alyx, with the touch controllers being fully utilised for different hand gestures, mimicking the act of opening doors, pulling handles, using computers, drawing and stowing guns and equipment, and manually loading weapons like a revolver and a pulse rifle. The former of which I can imagine being either extremely suspenseful in the heat of combat, or extremely tedious. I say imagine because there were two stumbling blocks to my enjoyment of this game. First, movement is analog rather than teleport based, and even the fairly short amount of time I managed in-game was enough that I had to have a lie down afterwards. Second, performance. Rogue Incursion has a minimum requirement of an RTX 2080 Super or RX 6700 XT, GPUs which are roughly twice as performant as a Titan X. This lack of power manifested at first with extremely short pop-in on stuff like textures. The datapad text was so blurry I had to hold it closer to my eyes like an elderly person, which I'm not. As I progressed through the opening areas, however, the frame rate really started to tank. The game is running at low, with dynamic resolution targeting 90 FPS, but I think it's dropping below 30 at times, especially once I get out of the ship and into definitely not Hadley's Hope. Maybe I'll revisit this later on with some more appropriate hardware, but for the purposes of this video, I don't really have that much else to say. I mentioned earlier on that this is pretty much my first serious journey into VR. Just because I'm a neophyte, however, doesn't mean I don't have standards, and I'm afraid to say the CV1 had some pretty apparent flaws. The lenses of the CV1 produce quite a lot of chromatic aberration, which is the rainbow fringing that occurs around objects further from the centre of view, and the resolution of both the lenses and the LCD panels themselves left a lot to be desired. The headset was also prone to fogging up, which might be a me problem. I am pretty hot after all, but the result is that bright text and objects against dark backgrounds tend to bloom and haze over, leaving me to stop every now and then to wipe the lenses off with a microfiber cloth. Also, as I mentioned when talking about Squadrons, the dynamic range isn't great. This means that brighter tones can tend to blend together, obliterating a lot of the detail in lighter coloured starships. Criticisms aside, however, I think this is an excellent first step into VR. Sure, it's old tech now, tracking requires these things, there are no cameras for inside-out tracking or for AR functionality, and it's tethered, requiring not only a spare HDMI port, but also 3 USB 3 ports. That's not even mentioning the setup process, which of course requires that you own and log into a Facebook account. The thing is though, you can forgive a lot of these, considering the price. I bought this one in very nice condition, boxed, for just £60, which is as much as some games, and a fraction of the cost of a Pimax or a Vive Focus. There are a ton of barriers to VR adoption, but high on the list is the exorbitant prices of current headsets. And while I can't promise the CV1 will be the headset you finally settle with, it could be the one that helps you decide if VR is right for you in the first place. Even if the answer's no, it costs you less than £100 to find out. Thanks again to Bellroy for sponsoring the video. Check out the link in the description for 10% off anything in store. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.